You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 383, recorded on Tuesday, June 15th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
This week, we're going to be talking about the Alabama mine strikes of 1908 and 1920. This is also a good topic for us to cover this week because there have been mine strikes happening currently, as we record this in June 2021, in Alabama since April of earlier this year. These were both coal mining strikes and fit into similar time periods that we've talked about previously, that period that was shortly before World War I, as well as the period immediately after World War I. And in many cases of similar ones that we've talked about around the same time period, you get these sort of echo strikes where they try it at one point, it doesn't work, and then they try it again after World War I. And in this case, both of them failed, but they had some interesting potential to them, notably because they were very well racially integrated strikes. And this was exceptionally unusual in the heart of the Jim Crow South. Unfortunately, as we'll discuss, the fact that these were racially integrated strikes by racially integrated unions really worked to mobilize a lot of very violent opposition to this, as this was seen as an existential threat not only to the capitalist mine owners, but to the entire racial caste system in the American South. But these were interesting attempts, and although these strikes both failed, there were certain elements of them that demonstrated very strong success, like at the beginning and things like that, that showed that the unions themselves had done a lot to bring a lot of people into this process of learning how to advocate for themselves and fight for their economic rights, things like that, and more importantly, perhaps, or at least as importantly, to understand the power of racial solidarity. And as we'll see, in some cases, some of these unions had actually worked to try to bring in strike breakers from previous labor actions into the fold to ensure that they would be less available as scab labor. And that was another thing that was a common feature plaguing a lot of other strikes, was you would have situations where the racial caste system was used to exploit those divisions and strengthen the hand of the employers in terms of hiring strike breakers. And this was less of a phenomenon in this, although still obviously an important thing to understand, because of that racially integrated union presence. And had things gone differently, we might have seen a very different picture in the American South. Unfortunately, it did not, but these are still interesting strikes that I think we can learn from. So, as always, at patreon.com/Arsenal for Democracy, you'll get our episode notes, including sources. The first one we're going to be quoting from quite extensively is a great article at the Encyclopedia of Alabama on the 1908 Birmingham District coal strike, which lasted from July 8th, 1908 until the end of August 1908. So, relatively short-lived, but still certainly worth talking about. So, I'm going to start us off on that one, and then switch off with Rachel as we go. Quote, in 1908, Birmingham witnessed one of the most remarkable labor disputes in American history. A bitter and often violent 2-month strike pitted one of the South's few viable interracial labor unions, District 20 of the United Mine Workers, against northern Alabama's Big Mules, the Birmingham District's politically influential wealthy industrial employers. The miners' crushing defeat in the strike set the tone for labor relations in the coal fields and in industrial Birmingham more generally. The widespread perception that the state had forcefully intervened on the side of the coal employers alienated many. But perhaps most importantly, the union's disarray in the wake of its defeat also greatly weakened one of the few organizations in Jim Crow Alabama that had managed, however tenuously, to bring black and white workers together. Rachel, could you tell us a little bit more about the situation in Birmingham before this strike broke out?
Yeah, so a little bit of background. Birmingham, Alabama was established quite late in 1871 to serve the newly discovered coal fields and other mining resources. Quote, coal operators calculated that low labor costs would be critical in gaining a competitive edge over their more established northern rivals. The availability of a large population of destitute freedmen and impoverished whites in the vicinity of the coal fields offered mine owners an important advantage. Workers who were both desperate enough to settle for meager wages and so thoroughly divided along racial lines that they would not organize to protest their predicament. end quote.
As it turned out, this assumption was only partially correct, as it actually was possible, at least to some extent, to organize across racial lines so that the workers could advocate for themselves. So the United Mine Workers District 20, based in Birmingham, had succeeded a short-lived statewide miners' union from the turn of the century. That was now defunct, and the United Mine Workers took over the unionizing efforts in the area. The mine owners had quickly made a coordinated push to lay off all union members from the previous union in favor of non-union miners. U.S. Steel, one of the most powerful corporations in the world, acquired the major coal producer in the state as a vertical integration maneuver to supply its steel mills, which gave its mines deep pockets to be able to withstand union pressures. Smaller mine owners drafted along behind in its wake, reaping the benefits, such as wage reductions to the miners. Rachel, could you quote from the article again at this point?
Yeah. District 20 declared a strike to commence on July 8, 1908, and the early momentum seemed to be with the union. Although only 4,000 out of 20,000 miners walked out on the first day, by the end of the first week, some 30 new union locals had been formed, and more than half the mine workforce had joined the walkout by the end of the second week. Among the miners newly organized into the union were a number of men who had been strikebreakers only several years earlier. In addition, the national press reported on the UMW's effectiveness in shutting down mine operations through mass picketing. A number of armed confrontations erupted between strikers and company guards. Miners were convinced that the only effective way to win their strike was to shut down coal production. Coal operators were determined to continue, even if it meant employing strikebreakers in place of their regular workforce. In these clashes, the union men seemed to be able to give as good as they got.
Now, by the end of July, according to this article, a sense of panic gripped district operators. The strike was more effective than they had anticipated, and the union seemed poised to win converts among workers in the largest mining operations. Mine owners resorted to a number of aggressive measures in their efforts to counter these developments, such as dispatching labor recruiters as far away as New York's Ellis Island to hire strikebreakers, and increasing their use of unpaid convicts leased from the state to maintain coal production. Mine owners also deputized hundreds of armed men to confront the workers and urged Governor Braxton Bragg Comer to declare martial law and dispatch state troops into the coal fields, a request he eventually granted. In addition, owners and their supporters in Birmingham's business community openly advocated vigilantism and resorted increasingly to inflammatory rhetoric to rouse white Alabamians against the interracial UMW.
The most remarkable feature of the strike was the union's ability to unite miners across the racial divide, a development that was unique not only for Birmingham, but for American society as a whole during this oppressive period in race relations. A parade of striking black and white miners through the streets of Jasper provoked fury among members of Birmingham's business community, who warned the UMW that its policy of biracial organizing would ignite racial violence. Prominent mine owners denounced the UMW's interracial workforce as an insult to Southern traditions and called for armed state intervention against the racially mixed strikers. And this, of course, included incidents of lynching. So interestingly enough, I found out about a local business owner / philanthropist, Louis Pizitz, who was a Russian immigrant, and he kind of went against the grain of the local business community and actually provided food to the striking workers that were set up in tent camps to support their strike.
So what was his background that made him sort of have a different approach on these civil rights and union issues?
So, as I said, he was a Russian immigrant, and he was also Jewish, and so it seems like he kind of had the liberal Jewish mindset that was pro-civil rights at that time.
And he was quite well-resourced, as I think also comes up in the next strike that we'll be talking about, through his sort of dry goods department store empire that he had been building for quite some time. And apparently that chain continued until the 1980s, from what we looked up. Now, as you said, Rachel, the striking miners were living in company housing before the strike and thus were evicted by the company when they went on strike. They set up tent camps, and that was a challenge for the strikers. And it also made them quite vulnerable to these attacks by the state itself when they were called in, really not just, as I said earlier, not just to support the capitalist interests, but also to support the upholding of the racial caste system of the Jim Crow system. Quote, the mine operators' increasingly strident appeals for forceful intervention, supported by lurid reports of racial mixing among striking miners in Birmingham's business press, eventually won over Governor Comer. In late August, he summoned UMW leaders to his office and warned that legislators would not tolerate what they perceived as efforts to promote equality among black and white miners. Union leaders denied such intentions, but their efforts were in vain. Under the guise of containing a public health nuisance, Comer ordered the military on August 26th to cut down the tent colonies that had become home to those strikers evicted from company housing. 4 days later, union officials declared the strike over, and despite grassroots efforts to continue the strike, the scale of the defeat was soon apparent. Mine owners, however, relished the new situation, confident that they could revitalize the coal industry on the basis of a more compliant workforce. 1 year later, the mines had returned to normal operations, and the miners' efforts toward labor reforms had ended in utter failure, end quote. And that's at least for the time, as we'll see. But interestingly here, Rachel, it does seem like they came pretty close, at least initially. The strategy of sort of biracial organizing, as the terminology went, is probably the only thing that got them as close as it did. It also made it very easy for them to be attacked, but I think they would have been attacked anyway. And you can see that sort of desperation over the course of the month of July on the part of the mine owners, and they really did have to go all out and get the big dogs in with martial law and the state guard troops and so forth. This could have gone against them with even a slightly more fair response by the governor at the time, but of course that wouldn't have happened because of the nature of how you would get to be governor in a state like Alabama in this particular time period. Did you have any thoughts on the 1908 strike before we move on to 1920?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what you said. The fact that the mine owners had to appeal to the highest office in the state, the governor, to break up the strike shows that they actually were kind of put on their back foot, at least initially, and then they did have to call in the really big guys to break it up. And it's interesting that Comer kind of couched it as a public health nuisance. So it was obviously like blatantly lying about the dangers of the tent colonies.
Right, and I think also, as there's been a lot of strikes we've talked about where the governor has come in and brought in troops in a way that was generally favorable toward the ownership class, of course, but in many cases they were just performing functions like, keeping access open for the strike breakers to get in and things like that, which obviously would have been helpful here as well. But the fact that they had to go quite harshly, conducting lynchings, attacks, breaking up the tent colonies, things like that. They had to really bring down the hammer to break up this strike. Again, to go back to that earlier point and just underscore that before we move on, 20,000 miners in the state, roughly, in 1908, and 4,000 of them walk out on day one, and it gets up to about 10,000 of them out on strike within 2 weeks. Representing half that workforce. That's a pretty significant number of people to mobilize and get them to walk off the job, and really demonstrated the idea here that the racial organizing, the anti-racist, or however you want to frame it, cross-racial organizing really went hand in hand with this and was probably the only thing that made this remotely effective. And the idea that you could somehow have organized in some other way and avoided that, I think, is just kind of probably wishful thinking. And this part, at least, does serve as sort of a reminder to us in the present day about the importance of this. But again, it's a question of demonstrating to people's self-interest why they're stronger together with this sort of cross-racial solidarity, and that these people are not your enemy, and doing that work, as alluded to earlier, of bringing in those previous strike-breaking workers from this sort of slack labor supply. And the fact that they also had to bring in, and this is going to be important for 1920 certainly, but the fact that they had to bring in the convict labor also plays into that dynamic. I would refer folks to our previous episode a while ago at this point on the rise of prison labor, initially actually in the North and then, of course, in the South for this type of work. But that convict labor as a means of strike breaking. I think the fact that they had to bring that in is another demonstration of sort of the way in which the state really had to put its thumb on the scale here, because the strike was doing what it intended to do up until that point. So let's talk about the situation in 1920, where they gave it another shot, and some things had changed, some things were similar, and you got a pretty similar outcome, with the state coming down pretty firmly on the side of the owners. I mean, just essentially completely coming down on their side with no exceptions. So this was a strike from September 7th, 1920 to February of 1921, so it lasted a little bit longer. And Rachel, could you tell us about this statewide strike in 1920?
Yeah, so as you said, it was across the entire state of Alabama by the United Mine Workers against coal mine operators. And this strike was backed by national UMW leadership, and the vice president actually came down to help out with the strike organization. This was a huge strike from the onset. About 15,000 out of 27,000 Alabama miners went on strike at the start, and they were looking for union recognition and also wage increases. These union miners were in direct competition in many coal fields against Jim Crow prison labor, working in brutal conditions for almost no money. And it was basically slavery just under another name. And although the U.S. Steel-owned mines that you'd mentioned earlier were starting to phase out prison labor, there were still many, many coal fields that were still using this convict labor. So as in 1908, many of the miners lived in company towns and housing owned by the mine owners that they were striking against, which again left them vulnerable to legal eviction and homelessness during the strike. So as we've talked about earlier, it was an integrated union, an integrated strike, which really made it very unpopular, both from white people and the black middle class, who saw black capitalism as their route to economic security and success. So this kind of shows the class fault lines that existed even among the black community. So the middle class versus these poor working class miners. So as in 1908, this was a violent strike with casualties on both sides, but significantly more on the Union side. The first blow was struck by the miners on September 16th, 1920, when they killed the general manager of the Corona Coal Company, Leon Adler, along with Earl Edgill, who was a company guard. Retaliation quickly followed, mostly aimed at the black miners. At least 16 miners were killed, more than half of them black, and it is unknown how many strikers were wounded. So the governor called out the Alabama Guard and the state police, which engaged in violent attacks and lynchings, basically openly siding with the mine owners, not even trying to even put on a show of keeping order. The state police even indiscriminately shot machine guns in a black business district in Pratt City. The governor was the arbitrator at the end of the strike, but basically completely took the side of the mine owners on every demand and denigrated black union members. The union was not recognized and basically withdrew from Alabama. Wages did not increase, and the striking workers were not rehired. So it's pretty interesting. At the end of the strike, the United Mine Workers just completely left it up to the governor to decide how the strike was going to be resolved, and he just very, very forcefully put the hammer down again against the miners. Again, the state really sided with the miners and really put down this labor movement very harshly. So I found an article titled "The Negro and the United Mine Workers of America," and this was in the Southern Economic Journal, published in April of 1943, and it kind of talked about both strike actions. And I wanted to point out that union officials were painted as outside agitators, and it was also implied that northern black UMW organizers were coming to Alabama to lead southern black miners astray. They were people in the area said that the southern miners were easily led and basically gullible and naive, and would follow the black organizers in their strike, but they weren't actually like smart enough to have agency in their own decision making. And so it obviously a super racist sentiment at the time. That was also very common. And here's a quote from the article. While there is every likelihood that racial friction would not have been absent in an atmosphere so tense as that of an Alabama coal strike, it is clear that the coal operators and their allies were responsible for bringing the question of color to the forefront and making it a central issue of the industrial conflicts of both 1908 and 1920 and 21. So I think it was great that there was racial solidarity on the part of the miners, but it obviously was kind of a vulnerability that the mine owners could exploit and turn popular opinion against the miners for this like racial mixing.
And again, I think we should underscore the point, as we've said several times now, that had they not approached this union effort with cross-racial solidarity, they would have been even worse off, because this racial exploitation possibility existed regardless, right? Had they not organized across racial lines, then you would have had, maybe a white union and a black union, if that, or just a white union and no black union, and then you would be vulnerable to that kind of strike-breaking replacement work. Similarly, that issue of the convict labor, which, as we've talked about in the South, certainly skewed quite heavily toward black convicts, although we want to emphasize again, as mentioned earlier in the episode, that there was a significant population of pretty destitute white workers in the Birmingham area specifically as well. These were vulnerabilities that would have existed regardless, and the capitalist class there was very adept at exploiting them. And so the only shot that this had at success was to try to overcome that through cross-racial solidarity and organizing across racial lines.
Yeah, and to kind of emphasize that point, after the strike was broken in 1921, the mine owners did start segregating the workers, so to prevent this kind of cross-racial solidarity from ever happening again in the near future. So that just really shows that the mine owners were actually pretty scared of what these cross-racial movements could do.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other concluding thoughts on any of this, Rachel?
It's really interesting to see how there was this kind of like populist movement that kind of was happening in the 1910s and the 1920s, but it pretty quickly snuffed out. This is also in the context of the Red Scare, the Palmer raids. So there was a kind of a fear of organizing and labor movements in general at this time. So that's something else to keep in the back of your mind while learning about these strikes.
Yeah, the other thing that I noticed too is that you get this tendency to not, especially I think maybe from the national level, I don't know for sure on this one, but it wouldn't surprise me given what we've talked about previously with United Mine Workers during this time period, a tendency to not keep their nerve when things started getting tough, or you had a tough break, a tough defeat like this. I mean, obviously these were two quite bad defeats, but I think it's interesting that they didn't pull up stakes and pull out after that first one, and they had a much bigger strike the second time, and maybe they should have doubled down on this strategy and kept pushing at it. Now, granted, one of the things that's happening at the same time, along with everything you just mentioned, is the very, very severe rise of the second Ku Klux Klan, which would have been a very significant force that was, I'm sure, quite terrorizing for obvious reasons we didn't get to into the graphical descriptions of lynchings that happened during especially the 1921, but let's just say it was quite dire. And so, I think that it would be worth exploring whether or not United Mine Workers should have maybe tried to stay the cause and keep doubling down on this strategy and say, look, like, eventually we're going to have a breakthrough here. We just need to keep working at it and keep organizing across racial lines in the South. Because, as we talked about earlier at the top of the episode with the formation of Birmingham, part of Birmingham's explicit strategy as this new industrial town or city was to beat the northern industrialists at their own game through all these sort of loopholes and exploitations of labor that weren't available in the north, and to really, turn every possible screw that they could to undercut their northern competitors. And we still see this, obviously, to present day, where companies move. If they don't move overseas, they'll move to the American South to be in a more favorable legal environment, a less unionized environment, and historically, of course, to exploit racial divisions, although that was certainly a pretty persistent challenge in many northern industrial cities as well, as we've obviously talked about on other episodes. Well, I will leave it at that, especially as we had a longer main feed episode this week. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on this week to talk about and help research the mine strikes of Alabama in 1908 and 1920.
Yeah, glad to be here.